Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to our London Climate Week action session on the quantification of climate-related risks and opportunities. I'm Helena, one of Agendi's partners. We're a specialist climate and sustainability consulting firm, and I'm joined by one of Agendi's fabulous managers, Victoria, who you will hear from later on in the webinar. As I said, we have around 30 minutes and we are going to be focusing on the increasing expectation to connect climate risks and opportunities with financial outcomes. And that's, of course, advancing analysis to meet the incoming ISSB-aligned UK sustainability reporting standards. There's a ton of acronyms throughout. We're assuming a baseline level of understanding. So if any of the kind of early acronyms, etc., are new to you, feel free to reach out and we're more than happy to do a catch up. But otherwise, we're assuming a base level knowledge of the key acronyms, ISSB, what's coming in terms of UK SRS. Brilliant. So let's get started. For those of us joining the first time, as I said, Agendi is a specialist climate and sustainability consulting firm. We work with large global organizations across a broad range of sectors, and our work spans the full sustainability agenda from knowledge, capacity building, through to impact management, strategic planning, implementation, and all things reporting. And financial quantification sits at the intersection of several of these key areas. And it's combining climate expertise with financial analysis, risk management, governance, and then, of course, feeding into those reporting capabilities. So today's discussion and presentation draws on our experience and also reflects many of the conversations that we are having with our clients who are looking to strengthen that connectivity between sustainability information and financial decision making. Lovely. So let's take a look at what we're covering in today's session. We have structured this webinar around 4 key themes. First, a very quick context on why quantification matters and also why expectations around it are increasing. We'll then introduce a practical framework for quantification, look at some of the common challenges, and then finally, we'll close with key takeaways and practical next steps. We are recording this session and we will distribute the slides. And as with all Agendi webinars, we do encourage questions throughout. There is a Q&A box. We do have a lot to cover. So if we don't get to your questions, we'll be more than happy to follow up with any queries direct offline. Right. So as I said, a very quick piece on the context setting of why quantification matters. And it's certainly moved very quickly up the agenda. At the broadest level, although we have significant global commitments and pledges, our global action remains insufficient to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And this, of course, increases physical risks and the risks from the transition response itself. And with emissions arising, organizations will, and they already are, facing physical hazards of climate and potential irreversible tipping points also. And we know that these tipping points will be a further step change, a non-linear change in terms of the impacts experienced on an organization. And on the flip side, to achieve a more optimistic and hopefully the direction that we're heading to curb these impacts, we will need accelerating policy, technology, market and behavioral changes, which of course leads to transition risks for business. And these dynamics are not just confined to sustainability functions. They are influencing cost, revenues, asset values, liabilities, capital allocation decisions all across the business. And of course, we need capital required for both an adaptation response and a mitigation response. And the key point is that climate risks and opportunities, if they are not already the case, they will ultimately become financial risks and opportunities. And we know that boards, investors, regulators, they need to understand these connections and then, of course, reflect them within the strategic planning response. And the move towards quantification is not just being driven by a single regulation or jurisdiction, but also a broader shift in market expectations. We, of course, know that investors need decision-useful information that enables them to assess resilience, compare organizations, and, of course, understand how climate-related risks and opportunities could affect future performance. And the regulatory response has also stepped up significantly. Of course, we have the incoming ISSB adoption here in the UK, and that is definitely raising the bar from our current TCFD aligned disclosures. There's also a business value component as well. Quantification of climate risks and opportunities will help prioritize investments from a transition, adaptation, mitigation response. And of course, to understand where they will have the greatest impact across a business, operations, value chain, etc. And as I mentioned, regulatory disclosure acceleration, it's still happening. Of course, there's some challenges along the way, but at a global level, we are still seeing uptake of increased sustainability disclosure requirements. We now have around 60% of global GDP, 40% of global market capitalization, and approximately 60% of global emissions either adopting or moving towards ISSB or ISSB aligned reporting. I definitely welcome this interoperability of these frameworks. And all of this, of course, reinforces the growing expectations for more consistent and increasingly quantified climate disclosures. And jumping very briefly onto our incoming UK SRS aligned ISSB disclosure. As I said, this is raising the bar again for financial connectivity. Within the UK, many of us have spent the last several years building our TCFD aligned reporting capabilities. But what's coming next with UK SRS are expectations of more rigorous scenario analysis, greater emphasis on the anticipated effects of climate, quantification where it's feasible. And all of this is expected to be mandatory from 2027. And overall, it's providing a clearer integration of climate considerations into business planning and decision making. And before handing on to Victoria, who is going to step through a quantification framework, I'm going to touch very briefly on what's expected at a granular level within the UK SRS S2 climate disclosure expectations. So at its core, UK SRS S2 requires organisations to explain how climate-related risks and opportunities affect financial performance, position, and cash flows, not just today, but in the longer term as well. And importantly, this extends beyond qualitative descriptions. The expectation is that there will be a combination of qualitative and quantitative information. And thankfully, there are some feasibility caveats. Where precise estimates are not possible, there is an expectation for transparency around those limitations or assumptions, as well as any areas of uncertainty. And as you can see on this slide, there are several components to this analysis. The first is, of course, identifying both the current and anticipated financial effects. And that includes considering how climate-related risks and opportunities may influence financial outcomes across time horizons. So that's the short, the medium, long-term time horizons. The second is when we're assessing climate-related factors, what could be those material adjustments to asset or liabilities? So in terms of this, we're talking useful lives, impairment assumptions, insurance costs, decommissioning provisions, or potential future capital requirements. Organisations will also be expected to identify which financial statement line items may be affected. So it's not a separate reporting category. Instead, it's expected to flow through existing financial metrics, including revenues, OPEX, CAPEX, liabilities, cash flows, etc. And this is where the connectivity becomes particularly important. So the challenge is it's not just about identifying what are the potential climate-related risks, but it's more about understanding the pathways through which those risks influence financial outcomes. Finally, UK SRS places significant emphasis on the quality of the underlying analysis. As you would expect, disclosures should be based on reasonable and supportable information with clear methodologies, scenarios, assumptions, and estimation techniques. So overall, definitely a shift. And as I said, we're moving from what are our climate risks to how do those risks influence business performance under different future states of the world. So I'm going to pass to Victoria here, who will outline a structured process to support these disclosures.
Perfect. Thank you, Helena. So having explored why quantification matters in the expectations under UK SRS S2, let's turn to a practical framework for translating climate-related risks and opportunities into decision-useful financial insights. One disclaimer here, I will talk mostly about risks. Our example is about risks. However, you can apply the same frameworks also for opportunities. Here you see an overview of the core framework, and what we see in practice is that organizations often have many of the individual components already in place. I'm sure you already conduct scenario analysis. You understand or have a rough understanding of your climate risk, and you report likely climate-related financial risks and opportunities. But the challenge is to creating here a stronger connectivity between those activities in financial decision making. And in this four-step framework, you see it's designed to provide exactly that structure. So when we look at the first steps is identifying risk drivers. This involves developing a clear understanding of the physical and transition risks that are most relevant to the organization, assessing where exposure exists across assets, operations, products, the value chain, and prioritize those based on potential business impact. The second step is selecting scenarios and time horizons. Climate-related impacts can vary significantly depending on the future pathway considered, so organizations need to assess resiliency across a range of plausible scenarios and align time horizons with business planning and investment cycles. The third step is translating impacts into financial outcomes. This is where climate analysis becomes financially connected. The objective is to establish clear pathways between climate risks in financial metrics such as revenues, OPEX, CAPEX, asset value, liabilities, and so on. And finally, those insights need to be integrated into decision-making and reporting. Quantification creates value when it informs your strategy, capital allocation, risk management, and broader business planning processes. It also supports more consistent and connected sustainability and financial disclosure. Throughout this process, transparency is critical. I will point a few times to that. Stakeholders are looking for a structured and defensible approach with clear assumptions, documented methodologies, and appropriate recognition of uncertainty. We'll now look at each of those steps in more detail, and starting with the identification of climate risk drivers. The starting point for any quantification exercise is developing a clear understanding of which climate-related risks and opportunities are most relevant to the organization. The objective here is to build a prioritized view of climate risk exposures across assets, operations, and the value chain. In practice, that means moving beyond broad categories such as physical and transition risk and defining risks at a level that is specific enough to support financial analysis. So meaning, for example, for physical risks, it typically involves mapping acute and chronic hazards to the individual locations, individual facilities, infrastructure, and suppliers. Examples might include river flooding affecting a manufacturing site, water stress impacting critical raw material suppliers, or extreme heat disrupting operations. For transition risks, the focus shifts towards business models, products, technologies, customer demands, policy development, and value chain dependencies. Examples could include carbon pricing exposure, changes in consumer preferences, regulatory developments, and technology disruption. As the example on the slide illustrates, identifying the hazard itself is only part of the analysis. It is equally important to understand the associated exposure and vulnerability, which assets or activities are affected, how concentrated is that exposure, what dependencies increase the level of risk, and what indicators can be used to monitor potential impacts over time. Addressing these questions requires collaboration across sustainability, finance, risk, operations, procurement, compliance, and legal teams. Establishing common risk definitions and assessment criteria across functions helps create a more consistent basis for analysis and supports stronger connectivity with financial reporting. The outcome of this step is a prioritized inventory of climate-related risks and opportunities. And this, first rough prioritization without quantification, of course, is critical because not every climate risk warrants the detailed modeling we are going into in a moment. The focus should remain on those risks with the greatest potential financial impact and strategic relevancy. Now, looking at the scenarios and time horizons. So once those priority risks have been identified, the next steps is to assess how they may evolve under different scenarios and across different time horizons. Climate quantification is inherently forward-looking. That makes sense. The financial impacts associated with a particular risk can vary significantly depending on how transition pathways develop, how quickly policy and technology evolve, and the extent of physical climate change. This is why scenario analysis sits at the center of the quantification process. In practice, organizations typically select 2 or 3 scenarios that capture different combinations of physical and transition risks. For example, a lower warming scenario may involve more rapid policy intervention, higher carbon prices, and accelerated technology change, resulting in greater transition risks in the near term. Conversely, a higher warming scenario may involve more limited policy action, but significantly greater physical risks over the longer term. Equally important is the selection of appropriate time horizons. Short, medium, and long-term time horizons should align with business planning cycles, investment decisions, asset lifespans, and strategic objectives. The aim is to ensure that climate analysis can be integrated into existing decision-making processes rather than operating independently. Once scenarios and time horizons have been selected, they need to be translated into measurable variables. These may include then inputs like carbon pricing, like energy cost, commodity prices, the temperature changes, regulatory developments, or any shifts in market demand. These variables provide the bridge between high-level climate scenarios and financial modeling. As I said, I'm going to point out transparency a few times across this webinar today. So, of course, also here, transparency is very important at this stage. Your methodologies, assumptions, and data sources should be clearly documented so that the analysis can be updated efficiently as those conditions evolve. And this is especially relevant, as Helena pointed out, the pace of regulatory change and increasing expectations for organizations so that you demonstrate resiliency across multiple scenarios. The outcome of this step is a structured scenario framework with clearly defined assumptions and time horizons that can support consistent financial analysis. Now, coming to the heart of this framework, the next step is now to translate those climate-related risks and opportunities into financial outcomes. This is often where organizations encounter the greatest challenge. The objective here is to establish a clear cause and effect relationship between climate-related risks and financial performance. That starts with defining the relevant financial metrics. So depending on the nature of your risks, this could include impacts on revenue, OPEX, CAPEX, asset values, liabilities, financing costs, cash flows. The key question is straightforward. How does this climate risk affect the economics of the business? For example, increased flooding risk may lead to higher insurance premiums, may lead to operational disruption or additional resiliency investments. So there are several financial factors that can be influenced by one climate risk. A carbon pricing mechanism could increase operating costs or influence demand for specific products. Changing customer preferences may affect revenue growth, market share, and the value of certain assets. Once a financial pathway is established, the next steps is identifying the inputs and assumptions required to quantify the impact. The next stage is estimating financial impact across the selected scenarios and timeframes. This is where climate variables are translated into financial effects. Given the inherent uncertainty associated with long-term climate analysis, sensitivity testing is essential. And using ranges rather than point estimates can provide a more balanced view of potential outcomes and help decision makers understand the implications or different assumptions. As Helena already mentioned earlier, the UK SRS S2 and also the ISSB S2 standard, they recognize this challenge. The expectations is to provide quantitative information where it's available and reasonable to develop, while clearly explaining methodologies, assumptions, uncertainties, and limitations. And where quantification cannot be achieved without what they call undue cost and effort, qualitative explanations remain important. Ultimately, it's the goal to create a structured and defensible approach that enables organizations to understand how climate-related risks and opportunities may influence financial performance over time. And once those financial impacts have been estimated, the next step is ensuring those insights generate and inform strategic decisions and are reflected consistently across financial and sustainability reporting. One of the most common questions organizations ask is how much data is enough to begin quantification. So we included a straightforward data hierarchy here. So the answer is that in the process, you should start with the best available information that you have and aim to become more sophisticated over time. The objective, as we said before, is to establish a transparent and defensible methodology based on reasonable and supportive information. A practical way to approach this is through a clear data hierarchy, like you can see here. On the top of the hierarchy is, of course, direct internal data. So, for example, the company-specific information that you have in your financial systems, any asset registries, any operational data, emissions data, procurement records, insurance claims, and so on. Where high quality internal data is available, it should form the foundation of the analysis. If not, the second layer is observable market inputs, for example, carbon price scenarios, energy market forecasts, insurance premiums, supplier quotations. Where this is unavailable, proxies and benchmark can provide useful alternatives. So, for example, industry averages, peer disclosures, engineering studies, academic research, and so on. If this is also not available, expert judgment can play an important role, particularly where uncertainty remains high or emerging risks have limited historical data. Through cross-functional workshops, engineering assessment, scenario exercises, and management assumptions, those can all contribute valuable insights. Again, one of the key considerations here is transparency and clearly outlining your assumptions, methodologies, and rationale for selecting the data. This, of course, then supports auditability and enables analysis to be refined over time as data quality improves. With this clear data hierarchy in place, organizations can develop quantification approaches that are both practical today and scalable as expectations continue to evolve. We included an example here on the right-hand side. You see the defined financial impact pathway for the risks, so reputation damage from failure to meet climate targets, which may then lead to reduced customer confidence, therefore to increase customer churn and ultimately to revenue loss. So that's the logic this example follows. You can see the data inputs with varying quality level of the data on the top. Then, of course, the next step is to apply the framework on the right and use the data you have available. You can see here that we calculated a base case with 6 million, that lead to 6 million revenue loss annually. Of course, when you change then the base case and really stress test your assumptions to also understand what factors really influence the outcome, you can see a range that we displayed here between 3.5 and 10 million pounds in potential revenue loss. Ultimately, of course, the objective is here to develop a robust understanding of potential exposure, establish a transparent methodology, and generate insights that can inform strategy, risk management, and investment decisions. Once financial impacts have been estimated and stress tested, the next steps is to integrate those insights into business planning and external reporting processes. So those insights that we generated, those quantifications, can help organizations and assess also resiliency, prioritize investments, evaluate trade-offs, and strengthen risk management processes. As this slide illustrates, climate-related risks and opportunities should be integrated into existing business processes rather than assessed in isolation. So that includes, of course, strategic planning, capital allocation, budgeting, forecasting, and enterprise risk management. There's also increased focus on connectivity between sustainability reporting and financial reporting. So stakeholders are looking for consistency across disclosures and clear explanation of how climate-related risks and opportunities affect assets, liabilities, equity, income, expenses, and cash flows. This requires closer collaboration between sustainability, finance, risk, and strategy teams. The objective is to establish a common understanding. And importantly, climate quantification should support executive decision-making. With that foundation in place, organizations are better positioned to respond to evolving reporting expectations while strengthening long-term resiliency and value creation. Now, I quickly hand it over to Helena for the common challenges and best practices.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Victoria. 30 minutes definitely goes quite fast. As you can see on this slide, we've outlined some of the key challenges that consistently emerge. And overall, what we want to avoid is quantification that is based on layering and layering of assumptions. It's more useful to have a limited boundary if the confidence level is higher. So one of the first challenges, it's consistent throughout the entire framework that Victoria stepped through, it's data gaps and system readiness. So climate and financial data, of course, is often spread across multiple systems, functions. And so the most effective approach is usually to start with the best available information, use proxies where appropriate, but keep in mind that you're refining your analysis over time. The second is financial connectivity, and we keep talking about this the entire webinar, but it really should be a collaborative exercise across sustainability, finance, risk, strategy teams. So the earlier that you can bring in these functions, the more decision useful and accurate the process is going to be. Lastly, the overall complexity. Given the extended time horizons, climate analysis, it's always going to involve uncertainty. So the focus should be around transparency of your assumptions, your sensitivity analysis, the stress testing itself, and where appropriate, generating directional insights that are going to support that future decision making. So definitely aiming for transparent, repeatable processes that can also evolve over time as your data quality, the methodologies, and all just in general, your organization capability, they will mature. Brilliant. I think we've got time to finish with a couple of the key takeaways. I can move on. Obviously, what's really important is that you're embedding sustainability considerations into existing business processes. It's going to create stronger alignment across disclosures and support that effective decision making. And then in terms of, if I focus on these three key takeaways, the first, and it should always be the case anyway, is to approach from a materiality perspective. Start with the risks and opportunities that are most material to your business performance, and then expand out from there. Second, we want to build a defensible connection between climate-related risks and financial outcomes. So keep saying it again, clear methodologies, transparent assumptions, and ideally generating a consistent response that can be repeated year on year. And lastly, you want to ensure that your quantification supports your decision making, and ideally those climate insights should also inform your strategy, capital allocation, risk management, not just the reporting exercise itself. Looking at the time now, we are at close, but absolutely happy to take any questions offline. I popped our details in the chat earlier on. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this London Climate Action Week webinar. There's a ton of events later on. If anyone's at the CDP event later tonight, do find me, say hello. And we've popped our emails on the last slide. We'll share the recording, the slides as well, and more than happy to continue the conversation. Thank you so much for your time today and joining us.